All right, everybody. So we're going to start doing some notes on volcanoes. We talked about volcanoes a little bit last week when we were talking about plate tectonics. We finished up plate tectonics, and now we're going to talk about some specifics with the landforms that are created. So we've got our notes on volcanoes, and we're going to get started. Now, the first thing we're going to talk about is what a volcano is. Now, a volcano is, as we probably can already sort of picture in our head, a cone-shaped mountain, as it says here, or a hill that has an opening into a pool of molten rock below the surface of the earth. So that's usually kind of what we picture in our head, right? But obviously that's not the only thing that a volcano can be. And we also want to think about, as we're going to see later on here, that volcanoes aren't only on the surface of the earth either. So we're also going to sort of talk about that as well. So let's talk about the parts first. So a volcano is a vent, or we can think of it as a chimney, as it says here, that connects the molten rock or the magma. So we talked about that earlier, right? That's our vocab word for like melted rock that's underneath the earth. It's a chimney that connects the magma that's under the earth to the surface. So that's how the magma gets out of the mantle, right? So the volcano itself is the vent or the chimney that lets the magma get out of the earth. Now, you can also see in the diagram there, we've got a couple of other vocab words that we want to look at. So we have the cone. Now the cone is essentially that sort of shape that we think of when we think of volcano. The cone is that shape. And we've got a couple of other things. So the conduit, that's that word down towards the bottom. The conduit is the pathway that the magma travels through. So the conduit is the pathway. The vent is that spot where the magma comes out and becomes lava, because remember, it's called lava once it's outside. And then at the very bottom, we have the magma chamber, and the magma chamber is where the magma sits at the bottom. Okay, and of course, as it says on the slide, the volcano includes the surrounding cone of erupted material. So that means that while, yes, the volcano is the magma chamber underneath, the conduit, and then the vent on top, it's also, once it starts erupting, remember the lava cools and forms igneous rock. The volcano is all of the igneous rock that's formed as it cools. Okay, so how do volcanoes erupt? So we talked about this a little bit when we talked about how igneous rock forms. Well, volcanoes erupt because pressure builds up, right? We'd also talked about this in plate tectonics. So the plates come together. We also talked about this when we talked about igneous rock, remember? Plates come together, we have pressure building up. And as pressure builds up, all that magma comes out. Gas comes out, magma comes out, and we have an eruption. And as that magma comes out, it becomes lava, gas comes out, soot comes out, ash comes out, and we have that big eruption. And you'll notice that as you see in this picture, we have lava coming out, you have soot and ash and gas coming out, and you'll notice that it's creating a layer on top of what's already there. So that's important because that's how you get that mountain, that's how you get that volcano shape that we think about. So volcanoes don't just form as sort of an already built mountain. They form by one eruption creating a layer of rock, and then you have another eruption, you create another layer of igneous rock, another eruption, you create another layer of igneous rock. So that's how you get a volcano. Yet layers and layers build up over time as more and more eruptions occur. So here's another form of a volcano that exists underwater along the ocean floor or seabed, and that's how we get islands, right? So we talked about that when we talked about plate tectonics. We talked about the fact that when you have plates that are coming together underneath the ocean, you can have volcanoes forming underneath the water, and that's how we get volcanic islands like Hawaii. And the way that happens is you have eruptions forming, they cool, as the lava comes out, it cools because it hits the water, and you get little layer of rock, and then another eruption happens, you get another layer of rock, and it builds and it builds and it builds, and eventually you get an island that peeks its head out of the water, and as those eruptions happen and keep happening and keep happening and keep happening, you get a huge island. So here we have a couple of different examples of volcanoes. So I know it's a little bit small on your screen. I am going to post these notes for you so you'll be able to go through them yourself. But we have the Parincocha volcano, which is in South America, the Kilauea volcano, which is in Hawaii, and that's still active today. It's gorgeous. And then the Koryazki volcano, which is in Russia. Liz, I think you actually went through some research on this when you did your radiation research. I want to say that what you did was very close to this in the region. So I think that you actually mentioned this in your project. I might be wrong, but I think it was very close in the region. But anyway, these are 3 active volcanoes that are still erupting today. And they're all 3 different forms. So they're all 3 different types of volcanoes, and you can see that because they're 3 different shapes of volcanoes. So you'll notice that the Kilauea volcano, the one on the top right, it has a very large, wide mouth to it. So the vent on it is very wide, and the sides of it are very gentle slopes. Whereas at the bottom, the Koryazki volcano in Russia has very steep slopes, and the vent is very narrow. And if you look at the top, the Parincocha in South America, it's sort of a little bit of a mix of the two. The slopes aren't nearly as steep, but they're not as sort of gentle as the Kilauea volcano in Hawaii, so it's a little bit in the middle. So we're going to talk about the different types in just a minute. So if we look at the types if we look at the types of volcanoes and how they form, we want to look at this diagram. So they form when magma reaches the Earth's surface, and they have volcanoes, remember, at destructive and constructive plate boundaries. So when we have plates coming together and plates coming apart, so they can form at either type, and they just form when pressure builds up inside the Earth. So either way, when we have plates coming apart, plates coming together, anytime pressure builds up, we can have magma coming out, lava coming down, and cooling. So when we have, here are our steps, pressure building up inside the Earth, when the pressure is released as a result of plate movement, the magma explodes up to the surface, it comes out as lava, and we have a volcanic eruption. Now, that lava cools to form a new crust, so a new layer of the volcano, and it builds up that mountain. And the rock builds up and a volcano forms. So, what about inside the volcano? Well, inside the volcano, the magma chamber is a collection of magma. That's why it's called the magma chamber. It's essentially like a room that's full of magma below the volcano. So underneath the volcano, you have like a little room. It's not little. You have a big room that's full of magma. And the main vent, so remember the vent is on top. The main vent is basically connected to the magma chamber. And that's a way for the magma to escape from the magma chamber. But the thing is, it's not open and just sort of, the magma's like just kind of coming out all the time. It's not really how it works. Essentially, what happens is over time, pressure builds up, and when pressure builds up enough, you have that explosive eruption. But you'll notice on the diagram, there's also these secondary little, almost like tree branches, there's these secondary little tiny vents. So occasionally, you'll have secondary little tiny vents that also branch off of the main vent. That's actually a good thing when you have those, because what that does is it allows for a little bit of pressure to be released now and then, so that rather than having huge, crazy explosions, you'll have smaller eruptions, and that allows for sort of less dangerous things. Because if all you have is that main vent to release the pressure, you get these huge, crazy explosions and eruptions. Whereas when you have the secondary vents, it basically allows for like a little bit of pressure to be released, and that allows for smaller eruptions to occur that are less dangerous. Now, here's different sort of categories of volcanoes. You might have heard this before. So we have volcanoes that are still active, and volcanoes that are still active, they still erupt. So volcanoes that are still active, they're still erupting. And remember, those three pictures that I showed you, those are of volcanoes that are still erupting, they're still active. And we also have dormant volcanoes. Those are ones that we're pretty sure they're still going to erupt. So in other words, they'll still go off at some point, but right now they're not active. So right now they're not actively erupting, but maybe at some point in the future, like a couple hundred years from now, they'll probably erupt again. And then we have extinct volcanoes, which means they're done. They're never going to erupt again. Their magma chamber is empty, done, not going to erupt again. So we have still active, meaning they're going off now. Then we have dormant volcanoes. So we know they're going to go off, but not right now, like maybe in the next couple hundred years. And then we have extinct volcanoes, which they're done. They're never going to go off again. Okay, and then let's look at the different types of volcanoes. So we have 3 different types. We have shield volcanoes. So shield volcanoes are gently sloping. So they're the kind that, remember in those pictures, I did say one of them had very gently sloping sides, so you can probably go back and look at those and see which one was very gently sloping. Then we have composite volcanoes. So composite volcanoes, they're also called stratovolcanoes. So when I give you a little project for this, you can also look them up by the name stratovolcanoes. Composite volcanoes, also called stratovolcanoes, have lava, but then they also have ash, and then they have lava, and then they have ash. So that's why they're called composite volcanoes, because composite means mixture. So those are sort of gently sloping, but they're a little bit steeper than shield volcanoes. And then we have cinder cone volcanoes. So cinder cone volcanoes, those are essentially kind of steep, but then they have like a big vent in the middle. And here's the thing. Usually cinder cone volcanoes will be real steep, like real steep, but a lot of them have like blown their top totally off because they're super explosive. And if you look at the diagram here, you'll notice that the cinder cone volcano that they have in the diagram has one vent, but it has no secondary vents. And that's important because a cinder cone volcano will be real steep on the sides, and because it has no secondary vents, there's no way to relieve any little bit of pressure. So a cinder cone volcano will build up real steeply, and then eventually they a lot of times have a super explosive eruption. And that's why in the diagram it has like a real big sort of divot in its vent, because cinder cone volcanoes at the beginning of their life, they get real steep real fast, but then eventually, because there's no way to relieve the extra pressure, they get these explosive eruptions and literally like blow their top off. So cinder cone volcanoes are very dangerous, and they tend to have like real explosive eruptions. So what can volcanic eruptions cause? Obviously eruptions, but what sort of are some vocab words that we can talk about? So volcanic eruptions can cause lateral blasts. So what does that mean? It literally means from the side of the mountain, like where you see those little secondary vents, you can actually have some of the gas and some of the pressure be blown sideways out of the mountain. So lateral means sideways. So you can see some gas and some pressure released sideways out of the mountain. That's a lateral blast. You can have lava flows, and that just actually means just the lava is flowing down the mountain. You have hot ash flows, and that's the same thing, but it's not lava, it's hot ash that's actually been kind of liquefied because it's so hot. You can have mudslides, and again, that's because you had dirt, but now it's kind of liquefied because it's so hot, and it slides down the mountain. Avalanches, and again, because of what's going on, the temperature's gotten so hot that whatever was at the top, ice and snow and whatever, is now no longer stuck there because it liquefied and it's now coming down the mountain at you. Falling ash, because as you can see in the picture, right, so you have gas and ash and smoke and everything coming out, well, it's got to fall down. And floods. Why floods? Because everything that was up there is now liquefied. It's flooding. So then we have volcanic eruptions, and when magma reaches the Earth's surface, it's called lava. So we've talked about that, right? We know that. And when lava cools, it forms rock. Igneous rock, right? So we know that too. Volcanic eruptions can happen at destructive and constructive boundaries, and we call them by slightly different names, but we know that. And not at conservative boundaries, so not at transform boundaries. In other words, that's where earthquakes happen. So they don't happen at transform boundaries, but they happen at others. Okay, so volcanic activity. In order to be considered active, a volcano has to have erupted within the last few thousand years. So that's actually a huge, that's a lot of time. So in other words, there's a lot of volcanoes that are considered active and haven't erupted in a long, long time. But on the Earth today, there are about 560 active volcanoes, which doesn't seem like a lot, but on the other hand, 560 active volcanoes, considering what happens when a volcano erupts, 560 active volcanoes is a lot. And it says each week, 15 to 20 of them will erupt. That's 15 to 20 are erupting every week. That's also, that's more than you would think. And every year, 2 or 3 volcanoes erupt that were previously thought to be dead. And that's also crazy. When I first read that, that's crazy. We think that they're extinct, and then 2 or 3 of them erupt anyway. In other words, there's a lot that we don't know about these things, which is crazy to me. You'd think we study them constantly, and then 2 or 3 of them every year erupt and we thought they were dead. That's crazy. So volcanoes and land formation. So volcanoes create almost infinite variety of land formations and terrain, which makes sense because this lava is coming down the volcano, and essentially when it comes down the volcano, it can dry and it can harden into just about anything. So there are 4 main types, right? So lava flows just can harden into these, they're beautiful if you look at pictures, but essentially these things that look like lava flows. Volcanic peaks, calderas, and volcanic necks. What you're looking at the picture is a caldera. It means like a bowl, essentially. And then lava flows. So this is a picture of a lava flow. Obviously, since it's red, it's still hot, but it's actually it's kind of pretty. So as it says here, they get their name from the manner in which the molten lava flows down. And you have a large, flat, lava-covered plain. Now, again, it's a landform that's unique to volcanoes, as are calderas and lava necks, but they're actually really pretty. And this is one of the things that we're going to look at in the next couple days. So, I'm going to stop the notes here because this is actually the end of the notes. But what I'm going to ask you to do once you've watched this is go back to the classwork section, and I'm going to have you guys look through some information on the different types of volcanoes and the different kinds of landforms that they form. And then I'm going to ask you to do something with that information, okay? So, that being said, I will talk to you in a little bit. All right, I will see you